Parashas Mishpatim is the parasha that tells us all the rules that a society needs in order to be a workable, moral society. And for most people, that's where it begins and ends. The part of the Torah that tells us what we need to keep people sane, to keep society sane. Comes along the Rebbe and says, actually, Parashas Mishpatim has the most incredible insight into what it means to be Jewish, into what the whole of Judaism is all about. Rabbi starts by telling us that he's discussed many times before. The name of every single parasha, which is part and parcel of Torah, even if it's just because it's a customary name, still even a minhag in Judaism is Torah itself. So the name of the parasha expresses what the primary theme of the entire parasha is all about. And the fact that this is the name that was chosen to represent this parasha tells us that everything the parasha is about, right up until the very last sentence of the parasha, is all encapsulated in this particular name. So we always have to pay a lot of attention to the name and say, how does this capture all of what the parasha is about, the essence of what the parasha is about? Going with that perspective, so knowing now that the parasha is meant to represent the entire theme from start to finish of every aspect of the parasha, you have to ask yourself, how does that work with this parasha, Mishpatim? How does the name capture everything about the parasha? Because as we're about to discover, it would seem that there's certain elements of the parasha, quite big parts of the parasha, that are not aligned with the theme represented by that name and may even be contrary to the theme. So we need to understand this. Obviously, we understand that most of the parasha speaks about these kinds of laws called Mishpatim, laws, practical, rational laws for society. Whereas the end of the parasha doesn't talk about these laws. It actually talks about the backstory of what happened leading up to the giving of the Torah, how the people prepared themselves, and how Moshe went up the mountain. That segment of the parasha, the very last section of the parasha, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this theme of Mishpatim. So how is that incorporated in and represented by the name Mishpatim? But it gets more interesting than that. We know very well that the specific term Mishpatim refers to those kinds of mitzvahs that make sense. You tell somebody don't steal, they can process, they can appreciate it, they get it, they understand it. And so on with all the other Mishpatim. And if that's the case, then the parasha sequence really doesn't seem to make sense. Because part of what's described in our parasha, at the end of the parasha, is how in preparation for the giving of the Torah, the Jewish people said, Nasa, we're going to do exactly what it says, and afterwards Nishma. Then we'll get to understand it. Hainu, meaning, that they made a commitment that they would do whatever it is that Hashem wanted them to do. And specifically, their commitment was that they'd be willing to do things even before they understand them rationally in their own minds. Now, is that not the exact opposite of what the parasha is? The parasha is called Mishpatim. Mishpatim are the mitzvahs that you do because they appeal to intellect, and yet there's a chunk of the parasha that talks about commitment, which is not intellectual, it's not rational. We're in, boots and all. Tell us the details later. Seems contradictory. So if that's the case, not only does the end of the parasha not seem to suit the theme of Mishpatim, it actually seems to contradict that theme. So how could the word Mishpatim be a catch-all that encapsulates that part of the parasha as well? The Shaila Zoi, this question about the fact that there are elements of the parasha that seem to be different from and even contradictory to the name Mishpatim, you don't have to wait till the end of the parasha to come up with that question. In the mitzvahs themselves, you could come up with a question. So, even in the laws that are expressed in this parasha, what do we have? One of the mitzvahs on the list in Parshas Mishpatim is the mitzvah that you may not cook a kid in its mother's milk, which is not a rational mitzvah. It falls into a different category called chukim, mitzvahs that are beyond the rational. So now how does the name Mishpatim represent everything in the parasha if we've already identified two major parts of the parasha that are not Mishpatim and are actually completely the opposite of Mishpatim? How does this work? So we know very well that at the beginning of the parasha, Rashi comments on the fact that it says Ve'ela Mishpatim with a vav, because you were taught, I'm sure, by your grammar teacher that you don't start a sentence, certainly not an entire chapter, with the word and, yet here we start the parasha ve and. So Rashi comments, quoting from Chazal, that what it means is Mari Shoinim Misinai, Afela Misinai, that it wants to create a direct link to the preceding parasha, which is the story of the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, where we know absolutely that the Ten Commandments and the other revelations of Sinai happened directly from Hashem at Sinai. So and what you're about to find, all these ordinary elements of the fabric of society that rational minds can accept, they're actually also from Sinai. They're not human inventions, they're divine imperatives. וידוע הפרש הפנימי במיימר הז"ל זה שאפילו גם המשפטים קיומם צריך להיות לא רק מפני שכן מחייב השכל, אלא לפי שמסיני. הנציבוי מהקדוש ברוך הוא. In other words, there's a very important lesson happening over here which Rashi alludes to, and that is that yes, there might be parts of the Torah that make perfect sense to you, but that's actually not good enough, and that should not be your motivation for fulfilling those mitzvahs. Your motivation should be because Hashem said so. That's why you do these mitzvahs. That's how it should be. Ah, there you go. Maybe that answers our question. You see, because we're linking the Mishpatim to the attitude of Sinai, which is that I do these things not because I understand and appreciate them, but rather because Hashem said so, well, there you go. If that's what Mishpatim includes, then it makes sense that we should talk about the Jewish dedication of Naseh. We're going to do whatever, even if we don't understand. And it makes sense that we should talk about milk and meat, even though that's not a rational law. Because right in the first word of the parsha, we've already been shown that actually all of the mitzvahs, even those that have a place in the rational mind, they're actually deeper than where the mind can go. And there's an element and a perspective to those mitzvahs which is beyond our minds, and therefore we should be committed to those mitzvahs, not because they make sense, as we're about to see, but because Hashem said so. So they've all got an element of chukim to them. So therefore we should actually all be committed to every mitzvah, including things that don't murder and don't steal or pay back money if you've done damage to somebody else's property. All of that might make a lot of sense to people, but that's not why we do them. We do them because they're Hashem's mitzvahs. And that's the uniqueness of the word mishpatim, that mishpatim actually does refer to mitzvahs that have an intellectual basis and yet come from Sinai. There you go. Solved the problem, surely, right? Well, not so simple. There are a number of reasons why this argument doesn't really help our questions. Why we're not yet satisfied how the name Mishpatim could incorporate all mitzvahs, including the super-rational ones. So we'll focus on two big issues. Number one, Rashi has quoted the one opinion, which is that Mishpatim is a direct follow-on from the giving of the Torah. However, there are other opinions, and the Medrash quotes this particular opinion on its own, which are Mishpatim b'Mara Nemru, that this parasha actually happened before the giving of the Torah. It happened when the Jewish people were in Mara, the place where the water wasn't drinkable, and then Hashem gave them a method to be able to purify the waters. And that was before they got to Mount Sinai. If you go with that opinion, which is an accepted opinion in Judaism, that ve'ele does not link our mishpatim of this parasha specifically to the giving of the Torah at Sinai in the previous parasha, but rather that this event already happened prior to the giving of the Torah, well, then we don't have our link that we wanted, and then we're back to square one. Then you have to say that mishpatim just simply means rational mitzvahs. So why is a parasha that is supposed to focus on rational mitzvahs talking about super rational behavior? Basa b'chal of milk and meat, which is on faith, you just accept it, you don't understand it. And Nasa v'nishma, this absolute commitment to Hashem, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. And then there's a second question that would apply even with Rashi's view, that our parasha is a direct follow-on from the story of Har Sinai to make the link between them. Still, secondly, ve'ikar, actually this is the main question that we have to ask. Even if you go with Rashi's view, that also, now this is going to be a key word, also, not only are the parts of Torah that we would never have thought of from Hashem, but also the parts of Torah that we would have as a society concluded on our own, still that comes from Sinai. Mishpatim. The fact that the Torah chose, or we as Jewish people chose to create a minhag which has the power of Torah, that the name of this parasha is going to be Mishpatim, that automatically, like it or not, emphasizes the rational nature of these mitzvahs. Yes, there's a track back to Sinai. Yes, there's an element of accepting that whatever we do is because Hashem said so. But bottom line, we're calling this all Mishpatim. We're highlighting the rational part of it. That means to say, the very fact that the whole parasha is called Mishpatim actually seems to give the exact opposite message of what we've tried to say, that it's also from Sinai. Actually, it seems to be saying the opposite. In other words, not as we wanted to say that actually deep down every single rational mitzvah is truly super rational because it's divine wisdom. It actually sounds like we're trying to say the opposite. If anything, it sounds like this parasha is telling us the exact opposite. You look at a mitzvah like meat and milk, which makes absolutely no sense to the rational human mind, says the Torah, but mishpatim, in other words, think about it, explore it, try and come to a rational understanding. So we wanted to say that the teaching is mishpatim, which makes sense, are actually really chukim, super rational, because they're divine wisdom. But the name of the parasha seems to tell us the opposite. It says if we plonk down basa b'cholav into this parasha and call it mishpatim, what we're saying is try find a rational reason. Naseh v'nishma, absolute commitment to Hashem, which seems to be so powerful that it's beyond the rational mind. It's mishpatim. It's got a rational angle to it. And that's effectively like the Rambam says at the end of the Laws of Tumura, that even though most of the mitzvahs, if not all of the mitzvahs, are beyond our comprehension, we have a requirement to delve and to try and understand them. So maybe that's exactly what the parasha is telling us. Something else we need to understand about this. You know, if you look at it, if you're going to go with the argument which says, Af elu misinai, that even the mishpatim are also derived from Hashem directly at Har Sinai, well then the order of the parashas doesn't seem right. Let's think about it logically for a second. Surely, if you think about it, the big deal, the big chap, the big innovation of Torah is not the mitzvahs that made sense to humans even before Sinai. Surely the whole innovation of Torah are mitzvahs that we would never have thought of, which is eidos. Those mitzvahs we would never have thought of. But now that we've been told about them, we can actually rationalize them, like Shabbos or Pesach or Tefillin, things that are a sign. You know, you can kind of rationalize them. And chukim. Surely the big chap of giving the Torah is to present us with things we would never in a million years have considered. V'tama davar, and there's a reason for it. Aleph es hamishpatim hayitzorach lishmor lekayim mitzad achiv hasichli. Gam lo leitziv Hashem k'divrei Gemara shelemod nichtafu din hu sheikos. First of all, because if there are mitzvahs that make sense, then by rights we should already have been doing them before the Torah was given. As the Gemara says, these are things that even if they had never been written in the Torah, they should have been written. Meaning to say, they should be part and parcel of a society. Furthermore, Bifrat al Pishtitas Ramban. Now this is where it gets really interesting. If you take the perspective of the Ramban, so he says, Dinim Shalem Nitztambu B'nei Noach. You know, we always talk about the fact that the B'nei Noach, meaning to say the broader world outside of the Jewish world, has 7 laws to follow. So one of the laws is that they have to establish a court system. Says the Ramban, it doesn't just mean generically that they have to have a court system. It actually as far as the Ramban is concerned, Already at the time of Noach, the entire world was expected to have laws about how you deal with people and their financial issues, theft, people who overcharge, people who press somebody to sell an item, people who hire laborers and don't pay them, people who harm other people, people who lend money, how to do transactions. Which means if you take the Ramban's view, before the Torah was even given, most of the Mishpatim were known and in play already. They were in practice. So Jews knew these things. In other words, the giving of the Torah is not, oh, now I'm going to teach you how not to steal or what to do if somebody breaks your window. Now we're going to learn things that nobody's ever heard before, like putting on tefillin or keeping kosher. In brackets, he tells us, now logically, look at the context. How did the giving of the Torah happen? It wasn't just a bunch of legislators who came together and said, this is how we're going to control society from now on. It was a revelation. Hashem came onto the mountain. Hashem revealed himself. People were able to see things that normally they'd only heard of in theory. Why? All of that is because they were being introduced to something that is way, way beyond the reach of the human mind. So therefore, you expect that the whole presentation of the giving of the Torah was those things that are beyond the human mind. And we're given shekach. Now, logically, if the whole point of the Torah is to introduce parts of Jewish living that nobody could ever have imagined, surely straight after the Torah is given, the next parasha should get into those details, all of the laws of mitzvahs that nobody had ever imagined. So why do we go straight from Parshas Yisro, the parasha of the story of the giving of the Torah, to Mishpatim, which is the story of mitzvahs that the people already knew about before? It doesn't seem to flow, doesn't seem logical. Yes, of course you're going to go back to Rashi and say, you know why Mishpatim is over here? So that we know these are also, again that key word, these are also from Sinai. Of course we need that. Of course we need that information. You're right. Also, but don't you first talk about the things that you have to talk about and then speak about the things you also have to talk about? In other words, if the giving of the Torah was the introduction of chukim and other such super-rational mitzvahs, surely that should be the first thing that the Torah talks about. And then after it says, oh, and also, in addition to those things which very obviously come from Har Sinai and directly from Hashem's mouth, because nobody in their wildest dreams would have thought of them, so even just as that happened, also, these are even included. But why on earth is Mishpatim straight after the story of the giving of the Torah? The question actually gets more serious. If you think about it, right at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, we have paragraphs that actually belong, don't you think, in the previous parasha, because they're paragraphs that tell us about the prep, how the Jews got ready to receive the Torah, how Moshe went up the mountain. Whereas all the details being described in this parasha, Rashi will tell us that only happens later. The people only get told that information later. Because remember, Moshe has to stay on Mount Sinai for 40 days. He receives the Torah. He doesn't come back down the next day and start explaining these things in our parasha. That's still going to happen. So the order just seems so strange. It just doesn't seem to make sense. Nimtza. So if you look at it, actually, this is all out of chronological order. We get the story of the giving of the Torah, then we get a whole lot of mitzvahs, which actually are going to be told to the Jewish people at least 40 days later, and then we end the parasha going back to what happened before the giving of the Torah. Valachas kama v'chama Pirush HaMedrash HaShavei Mishpatim b'Mora Nemru, and certainly if you're going to go with the view of the Medrash that our parasha actually happened at the time of Mora, so then it's definitely out of chronological order. We kind of go to the story of Sinai, then backtrack to the story that happened before in Mora, and then jump to the story of what happened before Har Sinai. It's so jumbled, it seems to be really strange. So these are the compelling questions we have on our minds at this point in time. Why is Mishpatim the name of this particular parasha? Why is it that incorporated in Mishpatim are things that actually are super rational? And if it's to track it back to Har Sinai and tell us that they all have a spiritual element to them and a super rational element, still that doesn't explain how it could fit under the umbrella name Mishpatim, which actually seems to say that the supernatural elements have a rational element to them. And then, of course, why straight after Har Sinai do we jump directly into the Mishpatim and not into Chukim, which would have made a lot more sense to be at this point in time? And why is the chronology all out of whack? When we say move on, we're going to have to conclude based on all of this two things. Number one, well, everybody agrees that the actual revelation at Sinai is not a Mishpatim experience. It's completely beyond anything that any mind, not only the human mind, could ever comprehend. We've already identified that at the time of the giving of the Torah, there was a revelation that was completely beyond the rational. Nevertheless, the fact that it is immediately hooked onto Mishpatim teaches us, in lesson number one is that all of that great, powerful spiritual experience of Matan Torah only really translates into reality when you start to do Mishpatim, when you translate it into the ordinary experiences of running a society. And number two, Leidach, on the other hand, if you look at the strange chronology, straight away you learn a lesson. You have to have revelation, then understanding, where you assimilate all of that super rational stuff into your reality, and then you go to the end of the parasha, you've got to go back to revelation, back to something that is beyond your intellect. And thirdly, even the fact that you go back to something which is completely beyond your mind, that has to be in the realm of Mishpatim. So here's a little bit of a heads up of what's going to come. We're effectively going to talk about the revelation of Har Sinai in one reality and one experience, and then we're going to talk about the experience of Mishpatim having two dimensions to it. A dimension that is completely within our control, that which we get to understand, and a dimension which is going to be beyond our control, but yet still has to be in our reality. So let's see how this all unfolds. We're going to learn this based on a teaching of the Shalach HaKadosh from two parashas ago. So the Shalach HaKadosh says that in Oz Yashem, when the Jews were thanking Hashem and praising Hashem for splitting the sea, saving their lives and drowning the Egyptians, so they said, Zeh Keli, they said, Zeh Keli, this is my God. Ve'anvehu, I will show beauty, I will gratify him. Elokei Avi, he is the God of my father, V'arei Memenu, and I will exalt him. Says the Shalom, and it's something Shehuv Alidei Chakmei Admor B'sichosav, it's something the Frierdiker Rebbe brings in his talks as well. Zeh Leshoinai, this is what the Shalom says. Keshezeh Keli, Shehu Keli mitzad asagasi v'di'asi, Oz v'anveim Leshoin anivuhu. If it's my God, like the Herman Wouk book, right? This is my God. It's personal. I understand. I have a personal relationship with Hashem because I've delved and I've learned and I've come to have to the extent of human ability, an understanding of Hashem to some extent. Then Anvehu is a composite of two words. Ani v'hu. We have a connection. Hashem and I have a connection. That implies that Hashem and I are bound together because the knowledge I have of Hashem becomes grasped by my heart. In other words, becomes part of my reality. But if I don't have a personal understanding about Hashem, I just have a tradition that we accept, that these are the things we believe. That's Shuelukei Avi. It's what was passed down from my father, who got it from his father all the way back to Sinai. Ozvare memenu. Then my experience of Hashem is exalted, which means aloof. Then I'm a little bit distant from Hashem, and the feeling that I have and the connection I have to Hashem is buried, concealed inside my heart. It's not grasped by my heart. In other words, the Shalom is saying, when you learn something and you come to an appreciation of your own, it's far more deep and far more personal and far more compelling than if it's just simply something that was passed down through the generations that you have to accept on faith. Kloimer. But no isef le'emuna. In other words, the Shalom is telling us that in addition to emunah, faith which we're meant to have, which is something passed down through us. We don't choose to have faith. It's shared with us from the youngest age. It's inculcated into us. Then in addition to that, it's imperative that I don't satisfy myself only with faith. I've got a responsibility now to go learn and to come to understand. Because the nature of people is, if there's something that I believe in, and it's only belief, it feels abstract, it feels far from me. Which is going to leave me with a feeling that Hashem is kind of buried deep inside of me, but not personal to me. Then but when it's mine, because I've learned and I've researched and I've debated and I've questioned and I've explored, and now whatever information I know about Hashem is mine, that's a whole different experience. This is the meaning of the pasuk that says you have to know the God of your father. Now it's starting to make sense. It's insufficient that Hashem should be yours because he was your father's. What's required is it's got to be personal. You have to know it. Don't quote things. Don't tell us which page we could read up more about it. It has to be ours. It has to be something we feel, something we live. That's actually the goal of Yiddishkeit. Not to have ethereal faith, but to have tangible awareness, knowledge. Now, based on what the Shalah says, which is a beautiful, magnificent, and a very deep and compelling thought, but something doesn't seem to make sense. The way that the Shalah is presented, actually the pasuk in Oz Yashir should have been the other way around, don't you think? Surely it should have first said that if Hashem is my father's God, in other words, if it's the God of faith only, then he is exalted and aloof, because that's my initial experience. And then I can choose to progress beyond that and to reach a point where Hashem is personal to me. Don't you think that's how the pasuk should have been? Because that's what the Shalah is saying. First you have faith, and then you have to express yourself and extend yourself beyond faith. Surely that's the way it is. First you have faith that was passed down through the generations, and then you have understanding, which is your own. Look at the language the Shalah uses. He says, in addition to the knowledge that was already part and parcel of you because of what your parents gifted you, you have to go further than that and learn and understand. There you have it. That's the order. First there's emunah, and then there's hasaga. First there is faith, and then there is understanding. So the pasuk doesn't seem to really express what the Shalah is saying. If anything, it seems to be saying the opposite. You start with Keli, your understanding, and then you go to Elokei Avi Varem Imenu, something which is exalted. So perhaps there's a way to answer it. The simplest way to explain this would be, look, at the end of the day, there is always more. It doesn't matter how much I understand. There's more about Hashem that will still remain beyond my understanding. So as I mature my appreciation, my intellectual appreciation of Hashem, so I'll now discover a new experience of emunah, of faith that I have to reach. Because seeing as Hashem is without limit, so Hashem is infinite. That means to say, no matter how deep my understanding or developed my insight will be, fact is, Hashem will still remain infinitely beyond me. And therefore I will still require faith to take me higher than that. So maybe that's the explanation. So what's the Torah telling us? Go and learn and understand and appreciate to the best of your knowledge. And then you know what's going to happen next? You will still have You will still have an element of Hashem that remains way beyond your reach. And therefore, what the Torah would be telling us is that even after you have succeeded in the avodah of coming to understand Hashem as prescribed by the Torah, you will still have the avodah of a deeper, more developed emunah that you will still have to develop. So maybe that's the answer. But it's not absolutely, as we like to say, glatt. It's not smooth. It's not clear. It's not 100% clear. We all agree, and nobody would debate it, that obviously after you have learned to an incredible level of understanding, there will still be more emunah to have for those things that are beyond your understanding. Still, doesn't answer the question, because the pasuk Zekeli Van Beyu appears to start with the logical, intellectual process. Surely it should have at least mentioned that there's a foundational faith you have first, then you begin the process of learning, and then you discover a far deeper, more profound faith after you have learned and understood. So Va'abir b'chol zeh, to explain all of these issues, how it is that Mishpatim relates to elements of Torah that are actually super rational, and why it is that after the Torah is given, we straight away go to the Mishpatim rather than first going to the Chukim, and how come the order seems to be inappropriate, and how come it is that the pasuk Zekeli Manvei, which has such a powerful word that no matter how much you understand, you'll still require emunah to go beyond that, but doesn't appear to talk about the emunah on which your whole intellectual pursuit started in the first place. So to explain all of that, we have to go to the core principle of why was the Torah given. Tachlis matan Torah hi bitul agzeira benegel elyonim v'sachtonim shetachtonim yalid elyonim v'tachtonim yalid l'tachtonim. We know very well, the Medrash tells us, that it was kind of like an East-West Berlin scenario, where there was an impassable wall between the spiritual and the physical, between the high and the low realms. And the purpose of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, was to break that barrier and to allow us the opportunity to transcend, to allow us the opportunity to cross over, so that the higher realms could come down into the reality of the lower world, and the lower realms could be elevated into the reality of the higher realms. Now the wording of here is very specific. The intention is not to blast the lower realms until they no longer exist, and instead to superimpose holiness over the lower realm. That's not what it says. It says, the lower realm has to remain intact and then be elevated to a higher experience. That's the purpose of Torah. Not to smash the world, to transform the world. That's why it wasn't enough that at the time of the giving of the Torah, the divine should be revealed and Hashem should come down onto the mountain, which is an incredible thing and something that would never be repeated in history. But it's not enough on its own. But the Medrash insists that there was also a need for the world as it was to be elevated as well. In fact, even to the extent that the Medrash first talks about the elevation of the lower realm before it addresses the descent of Hashem into our realm, even though practically that's not how it happened. Practically Hashem approached us first. Hashem took the initiative. But the way the Medrash describes it puts a certain priority and emphasis on the concept of elevating the lower realm. If you think about it, the higher realms coming down into this world, Hashem appearing in this world, is not anything that we could claim credit for. We do nothing in order for that to happen. It's Hashem's volunteer, His volition. As the Medrash tells us, Hashem said clearly, I'm going to come first. That's why it says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, first. Hashem first came down onto the mountain. So because it was all Hashem's initiative, therefore, at that point in the story, there's this thunderous revelation of godliness that booms into our world, and the whole world just gets overwhelmed because the world has done nothing to prepare. The world has done nothing to elevate itself. It's just a world now suddenly being bombarded with huge divine radiation. So the world effectively starts to shut down. Look what happens. Vayechrad kol ha'am. The people begin to tremble. Vayaram vayonu vayanda mirochak. The people are shaken up and they move to a distance. In fact, the Gemara even goes to the point that they were thrust back, 12 kilometers back. And the neshamas popped out of their bodies and they needed angels to come and resurrect them. Vayechrad, not only that, mitzvos shalom b'chlal vayechrad kol ha'hor. Not only did the people shake, but the Torah reports that the earth shook, the mountain shook. They're getting bombarded right now with divine revelation that they're completely ill-prepared for. To the extent that the Medrash tells us you didn't hear a bird chirp, that it was absolute silence in the world. The world was neutralized by this atomic bomb of divine revelation. But that wasn't the point. That was experiential in the moment. But it wasn't the goal. It wasn't the point of Torah. The purpose of Torah is that the world should remain intact, should remain healthy, should remain whole, should remain world, and in spite of all of that, be elevated to connect in a meaningful, deep way with Elyonim, with the higher realms, with Hashem. There's only one way that can happen. There's only one way you can take an entity intact and elevate it, and that's if the entity works to elevate itself. The only way you can take the lower realm and bring it up to Hashem as a healthy, wholesome lower realm is if the lower realm is working somehow to align itself. Of course, it goes without saying that none of this could happen unless Hashem initiated the process. That's why first Hashem has to come down into the world. Like the Medrash uses the expression, Hashem says, I'll start the process. And those are the words of the Pasuk. Hashem came down on the mountain before Moshe went up the mountain. And now we're starting to see how the whole thing pieces together. The first thing you need is a shot in the arm. The first thing you need is a wake-up call. You need something that's going to shake you to the core of your being, that's going to totally change everything about you, that your old self begins to crumble because it's so overwhelmed by the revelation. And that's the catalyst. And then that incredible revelation recedes into the background, but now you've been shaken. Now you've been primed that you can actually do something. What you do next, that's really what's going to count. So now we can start to put the pieces of this puzzle back together again, because these two concepts, the concept of bringing the higher realm down into our reality, and then as a response, a healthy, appropriate response, elevating our reality back towards Hashem, that in our personal experience is the two chapters of faith and understanding. Faith is not something that we work to achieve. How does one have faith? Hashem has already implanted it within us. Or to put it into the Shalah's expression, it's tradition that is passed down through the ages and it seeps into our consciousness. Even though our faith So now you could have a person who's doing what they should because they have great faith and therefore they do what Hashem says, but it's all on faith. That means I'm not in the picture fully. I'm not linking up with Hashem in a meaningful union, because ultimately I'm just riding on faith that sits somewhere in the abstraction of my mind because it was passed down through the generations, and that's why I'm doing these things. but it's not where I am. So faith is powerful, but it's not necessarily transformative. Dafka, when a person works to understand, understanding is ego-driven. Let's be honest. I enjoy understanding. I like it. It satisfies me to know what it is and why it makes sense. So there's a sense of me in that process. Now I'm in the game. Now it's me in the mix. Now it's not just me riding on things that we've always spoken about in our family, always done, traditions we've always followed. Now it's me. I own this. I worked for it. I sweated to understand it. Now I own it. It's mine. I and Hashem have a meaningful connection. But make no mistake, none of that intellectual process would be worth anything if it was not built on a foundation of faith. Like in the story of the giving of the Torah, in order to facilitate the possibility of a healthy lifting of the lower realms, first you had to have the introduction of the higher realms. We know quite well that human intellect is open to corruption and has personal bias, and before you know it, little things become big things, and you can get everything really wrong if the foundation is the human mind. Because a person has so many personal biases and so many predispositions and preconceptions, so by the time you finish learning something, you're actually looking through your eyes rather than the information's eyes, rather than the truth's eyes. And therefore there's no question when it comes to Torah, it has to be built. Any intellectual process has to be on solid ground of absolute faith. So that way you'll know that what you learn, you're actually getting to the truth. You're not shooting an arrow and then painting a target around it. You're looking to find out what the truth really is. And now we can start to understand the flow of what looks like it's not a chronological piece of Torah. It may not be chronological. The Torah is not a history book. But it is incredibly important for us to understand the processes and how they happen in a healthy way. Parashas Yisro, Parasha Shematan Torah, the primary theme of the preceding Parasha Yisro is that is the Parasha of the giving of the Torah, and there the emphasis is Hashem's gift to us, that which came from on high into our world, that which is actually beyond our reach but has been given to us. And that had an impact on us, that we all walked out of there with faith that would then last throughout the whole of history till today. The fact that you and I are born ma'aminim, b'nei ma'aminim, we all have faith, we are the children of people who had faith, that all began at that point in time, because that actually shook us up completely and reconstituted us as people. We're no longer ordinary people. We're faith-based individuals. Once the Torah has been given, and that great, incredible catalyst is over, now the baton is passed to us, and now it's our responsibility to elevate the lower realms towards Hashem, to make a connection. That's our work, where we have the responsibility to create a connection between the reality of us, the reality of the world that we live in, and Hashem. That's why straight after the giving of the Torah, what's the first topic we describe? Things that are rational to the human being. Straight after this overwhelming revelation of godliness that short-circuited our brains and installed emunah in us, the next thing we have to do is learn Hashem's wisdom in language that we can comprehend, so that we can, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, create this magnificent union between my mind and Hashem's wisdom, which in turn makes an incredible union between Hashem and me, as I am, a human here on earth, with all of my failings. And then we achieve the goal and purpose for the whole of the giving of the Torah, which is the fusion of the high and lower, the divine and the mundane, Hashem and the human. Alpinian zem is bor gam bepnimis onyonim achilik ben adrash afeinu misinai. Hashem is shehuva pishrash al Torah mochach shimatim lefi alim ad derech hapshat. With all of this information, we can now understand why Rashi, who takes the pshat approach, what is the simplest way to understand what the Torah is saying, and he says ve'ela mishpatim is a link to the previous parasha that you should know. Even the logical parts of Torah are done not because of the logic, but because they are Hashem's word. And let's compare that to the Medrash, which is clearly not Pshat. The goal of the Medrash is not to tell us the simplest understanding, but a more involved understanding, where the Medrash argues that this parasha actually happened in Morah, which means before the giving of the Torah. Effectively, Rashi and the Medrash are describing two different stages in a person's spiritual development. When you're at that stage, like the 5-year-old who needs Rashi's interpretation because that's all he's capable of learning at that point. In other words, you're just starting out on your spiritual journey. You don't yet have a deep, meaningful, intellectual appreciation of God. You've got simple faith. You don't have developed love and fear of Hashem yet, which are direct consequences of meaningful understanding. All you have is faith. Not all. Faith is powerful, but you haven't developed it and owned it yet. At that point in time, we say, whoa, be very careful over here. At this point, don't you dare think that because something makes sense to you, that's why you should do it. Because you have to realize that you are still vulnerable to the temptations and the misguided thinking of your own nefesh habahamis. So don't follow Torah at that point by what makes sense. Therefore, a person has to know at this point in time, these laws that I'm looking at right now, which make so much sense to me, that's not the point. The point is they're divine. The point is they're super rational. I have to think of the great turmoil, the turbulence of the giving of the Torah, the drama of the giving of the Torah, because that great light and sound show of the giving of the Torah created bittul. The people lost their sense of confidence, they lost their sense of ego, and that opened them up to accept what Hashem had to say. And that's where you are when you're early on in the stage of spiritual development. You cannot afford at this point in time to voice an opinion. At this point in time, you've got to sit back and say, I'm open. I have bittul. Hit me with what's true rather than with what I understand. Like the Gemara says, that a person should always agitate their good inclination, Yetzer Tov, against the Yetzer Hara evil inclination. The goal of that is to get your nefesh elekis to scream at, so to speak, to shake up your nefesh habahamis to such a point that it dissolves and it moves out of the way and allows the person to be open to what Hashem wants. But by the time you're learning Midrash, which implies that you're delving more deeply intellectually into the Torah, which means you've now graduated to a point where you have deep meditation on Torah, deep contemplation, and it affects you, that you're actually feeling a passionate drive towards Hashem, and you stand in awe of Hashem. Then the circumstances change completely. All of Riyos Mesugol Lekayim Mitzad Zeh B'Mora Nemra Haynu Mipnei Shekach Mechuyev Sichloi. At that point where a person has grown, then you get to the point where you say, I can own this. I can actually say it makes sense to me because I've been through the bittul process. I've gotten rid of all the ego and misguided behavior. And now I'm at a deeper level of understanding. Now I'm willing and prepared and allowed to say, I understand it. This is mine. And therefore you could say that the Torah, that these instructions were given at Morah, which means to say something which kind of is not directly associated with the great experience of the giving of the Torah. Now, even the Medrash agrees that first you have the parasha of Yisroi, which describes the giving of the Torah, and only then are we told Mishpatim, regardless of whether it may have happened chronologically earlier. Because the Medrash, of course, would agree, like we would all agree, that you can only begin the process of intellectual study once you have consolidated faith. You have to have a Yisroi first, and only then can you go into a Mishpatim. But still, so the Medrash will tell us quite correctly that yes, I have to have emunah that sits at the core of my entire experience of Judaism, but I don't live only with emunah. I have a responsibility to learn, to understand, to contemplate until it feels like mine. I have ownership. With this, we can understand a deeper insight into something the Rambam says, Shemashomer Chazal, that when our sages warn us, Lo yoimar adam I efshi chulei, ele efshi mo esesh, abi shebashamayim gozar olai. So the Chazal tell us that a person should not say, I don't want to eat treif. No, you should say, I do, but Hashem has instructed me not to. So the Rambam says that only applies to mitzvahs that have no rational basis. That's when you could say, I would love to do it, but Hashem said no. I'd love a cheeseburger, but Hashem said no. God forbid. Says the Rambam, however, if it's something that is logical, mishpatim, like for example murder, a person dare not ever say, I would love to murder, but Hashem doesn't allow it. God forbid to say such a thing. That would imply a person who is a deeply corrupted individual. Now, hang on a second. Doesn't Chassidus tell us that even those parts of Torah that make sense, we should do them because they are what Hashem said? And here the Rambam saying it should resonate with you and really make sense to you as an individual. So which one is it? Do we not murder because it makes sense to us not to murder, or do we not murder because Hashem said not to murder, and we may be indifferent or perhaps even have an opposing view? And the explanation is, as we've explained through the Sikha, yes, the underpinning of everything Jewish is to accept Hashem's authority and do what Hashem says, like it or not, understand it or not. Because as we've explained, it is unreliable to trust our own feelings or our own understanding. And critically, the minute a person's entire Judaism becomes what is rational to them, they lose what Judaism is about, which is to serve Hashem. I am Hashem, your God, who told you these things. So we should never slip into the error of saying, because something has a rational basis, that's why I'm going to do it. Then I lose out the connection. But on the other hand, but as we've already described, the reason that they are mishpatim, what they illustrate to us about Judaism, is that it allows me to own it. It allows it to seep into my consciousness and become the way I think, the way I see the world. The way, the goal, the purpose of Judaism is to become so real to me that eventually I actually said, I don't want to do that. It's not because I understand what's wrong with it, it's because it becomes me. What Hashem wants becomes what I want. Now, even though we have said that there's a tremendous advantage to when you understand Torah and understand the meaning behind it, and that's the specific and only way in which a person can become totally one with Hashem, specifically through learning Torah and understanding Torah mikol mokim. But we do know that there's a huge drawback to the human mind, and that is, it's finite, has limitations. So moving, then that means that yes, I can grasp godliness with the mind, but obviously it's the only degrees of godliness that are accessible to human minds. But Hashem fundamentally is inaccessible to the human mind. אך הכוונה שמתן תורה חיבור אלים ותחתן, הלא היא גם של עליונים אלה שהם למעלה מהסוגס האדם ואפילו אלה שאינם בגדר הסוגה כלל, יבואו אף הם לידי חיבור הם התחתונים. But isn't the goal and purpose of Torah Elyonim that the highest of the high should be able to come down and enter the experience and reality of the tachtonim, meaning to say, even the parts that we can't understand, and it's not because of human limitation, but because there is no seichel and never will be that can grasp the infinite. Surely that's also supposed to come into our reality. And then you have the impossible paradox that such a great revelation of godliness should enter into our world without destroying us. That we should still remain finite beings and yet at the same time have happy access and healthy access to infinite God. How does that all work? That's why we say after Zekeli Van Veyu, after you have learned, after you have understood, then you get to Zekeli Van Veyu, then you get to a whole different exalted dimension of godliness, meaning as we've already said, the built-in faith that we all have because of the things that were passed down through the generations, that's not something we have earned. It's built in. And as we said, therefore I don't get it. It's not my credit. It's not part and parcel of me. It's just what is kind of the framework in which I live. That's why when the Jewish people are singing to Hashem, they don't talk about this faith because it's not something to sing about. It's not something we earned. It's not something we achieved. But then a person learns, and because the person learns, they come to this incredible union with Hashem. I and Hashem are in absolute harmony and unity. In fact, ani vahu, which were two separate words, now become a single word to show how deeply connected we are. Then something brand new happens, which is then I am a changed person. Because I've worked, because I've learned, because I've understood, now those elements of godliness that should be so powerful, like another Matan Torah that blasts me out of my body, but because I've learned, I won't understand it, but I can absorb it. I can now absorb godliness beyond the scope of my personal reach. Because I've now become one with Hashem, even the parts of godliness that would fry my brain don't. Because now I'm not just me. I am now one with Hashem. I have power. I have the ability to receive. Now we get it. You get the story of the giving of the Torah, the implanting of original faith. Then you have the story of Mishpatim, the deep understanding and becoming one with the material, which leads us to the end of the parasha, more about the giving of the Torah, and acceptance of something we don't begin to understand. And that's why in the parasha we have the laws of meat and milk, which are super rational laws. Because when I have the concept of Mishpatim, the amalgamation and harmonizing, synthesizing my mind with godliness, then as the name of the parasha indicates, even those things become Mishpatim. They become personal, they become accessible, they become real, they don't destroy me. I may not understand them, but I can absorb them. וכשם שכך הוא מנגיע למתן תורה בכלל, שהתחיל בו פרשת ישרו, הגיל ממילא הנ"ל ליוסף ממציאות התחתן, ולאחרי זה מתחיל העבודה סעודם פרשת משפטים. Just as in Torah, generally speaking, we see that this is the flow. First, you have a general introduction of general spirituality, which produces emunah, and then after that, you have the personal translation of all of that into your experience. And in the translation into your experience, the two vital steps. First, I go through the simple understanding of Mishpatim, which is that I understand Torah, of course, predicated on absolute faith in Hashem. Mishpatim, and then eventually from that I'm able to graduate and achieve a state where the highest realms become real and tangible to me without any damage or without any upset. The same flow, the same order of events is exactly what happened when Chassidus was revealed. The first permutation, the first manifestation of Chassidus in the world was the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidus, which was not about explaining the concepts of Chassidus, that we should have a thorough understanding, as much as it was about instilling faith in people. The primary focus of the Baal Shem Tov's Chassidus was to instill emunah, faith in every single person, and that faith was through the conduit of the tzaddik. But the goal of Chassidus wasn't to have a big, powerful Rebbe who would inspire you and blast your mind, and then you would walk out of there emboldened with faith. The purpose and goal of Chassidus is that it should be yours, through your understanding and your appreciation. It should be personal. That it should be b'sichloi v'al yodeh b'keiches hapnimim shel ha'adam. The goal of Chassidus is that it should seep into your mind, and then through that into all the other personalized elements of your neshama, love of Hashem, awe of Hashem, etc. And therefore, just like after Yisro you have Mishpatim, bringing all those brilliant ideas down into a human consumption version, after the Baal Shem Tov, we had this incredible beauty of Chassidus, comes the Alter Rebbe to explain how you can understand it and own it and really get it in a personal way. That's the goal and that's the big innovation of the Alter Rebbe, that Chassidus should become yours. It should be embedded in you. It should be something you understand and appreciate. This is the explanation of the saying attributed to Rabbi Yitzchak Badicheva, that all of the students of the Maggid of Mezrich all ate out of the same bowl. Bari says, und der Litvak hat zugenommen der Verchushke, that the Litvak, the Lithuanian, which referred to the Alter Rebbe, he took the smetana, he took the best. He got the best part of the dish, the fattiest part of the dish. Why? Why did the Badicheva say this? Why? Because the Alter Rebbe was the one who had the opportunity to take everything that Chassidus is all about and bring it to its ultimate fruition. Just like Mishpatim takes the revelation of Har Sinai and brings it to the person in a deep personal way, that's what the Alter Rebbe did with Teres Chassidus Chabad. When a person has real understanding of godliness, as we get through Chassidus Chabad, to the extent that we become absolutely unified as a single entity in Eoz, then even though all of that learning will eventually bring a person to understand that the ultimate understanding is to know that we will never know, because Hashem is fundamentally beyond knowing. Which means that you get to a point that you understand that even what you understand is truly beyond your understanding. In inyonim elu v'yesal kein afilu inyonim shemelachatchila einam begeder hasoga einam inyan shel makif bilvad etzlei lemurgoshim b'adam gufa mishpatim. The power and beauty of Chassidus is that all of that which is beyond the event horizon of your understanding, all of the power of Torah, the power of godliness, the things that cannot ever be understood, are still not aloof, abstract. They actually sit really in me. What the Rebbe is telling us of here is a phenomenal concept, that Chassidus Chabad is not just to explain concepts to us in a way that is unprecedented, but it's to give us a gateway to Elikus, that even Elikus that cannot ever be understood will be part and parcel of us in a real and meaningful way. Through investing tremendous energy and effort into our Torah learning, specifically learning Chassidus Chabad, that way we'll merit to learn the Torah of Mashiach, where the learning won't be as we learn today, where you learn things bite by bite, piece by piece, but rather where you see the whole picture. When Mashiach comes, you'll see the whole concept in HD, in one shot. Until eventually we'll be able to see Hashem directly speaking to us. It should happen b'mheira v'yomeinu, and more than that, it should happen takeoff from miyad mamash. It should really happen right now, and then we can take the ultimate experiences of Gilo Yalikus Anochi Hashem Rekecha and have them in the most Mishpatim way, where they're absolutely personal and real to us. It should happen right now.